Welcome back to the 6Ps podcast, another episode, and today we're going to be looking at the key theme of judgment within both the texts. So we have some key questions I'd like you to have a think about. Who is judged? Who judges others? And who is not judged? I always say a great way into any theme is to think about the characters, and while we obviously want to explore ideas and themes and go a lot deeper than characters, they are a great way to open up the themes and to start making connections between the texts. So in terms of who is judged and who judges others, we'll start with who is judged, and it's the girls to begin with. It is definitely Abigail early on, but she shifts the blame and the judgment towards characters like Tituba, who then transfers it on to Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Bridget Bishop as well. And these are lower class, vulnerable women who don't have anyone to speak up for themselves. Again, I've mentioned this a number of times, but they sit on the periphery of these societies. So it is really difficult for them to avoid judgment and persecution. John Proctor is also judged. He is judged by the court and by the society, of course, based on his actions or his little things like not being able to recite his commandments, not going to church on the Sabbath, working on the Sabbath as well. And we all know that quote by Reverend Hale about theocracy and the fortress and any cracks in the fortress will be counted against a person. He is judged by himself, obviously, for his actions, and that comes up very early on. In fact, in Miller's commentary, he describes John Proctor as a sinner against his own moral code, and we see that throughout the text that he fights with himself. It's almost like a psychomachia to bring in some Women of Troy information. The last one, obviously, is judged by Elizabeth as well. She judges herself too, I should say. And we might touch on her a little bit later on. But innocent individuals are also judged, and Rebecca Nurse is a good example to use there. In The Dressmaker, Tilly is judged by herself. She does feel guilt and she does feel blame for what happened to Stuart Pettyman, and the community also blames her for that and judges her for that. They also judge Molly, and this comes down to those social codes and conventions. So the fact that Molly gave birth to Tilly outside of wedlock is counted against her. She's judged for that. Tilly is judged, and they even are labelled with names: Mad Molly, Bastard. Tilly, of course, faces bullying from the kids, where they refer to her mum as a slut. The whole town are also judged. They judge each other, and we know, and we'll touch on this a little bit later on as well, the secrets that everyone holds, or withholds at times as well, and the fashion as well, how they judge each other, how everyone wants to be dressed better than Elspeth Beaumont. Who judges others? Well, in the Crucible, the obvious answer is the court, represented by Deputy Governor Judge Danforth. He is the law, but the church too, or through Reverend Parris, also judges other people. Puritanism, this society revolves around judging other people based on the way they act within their community. And I mentioned John Proctor before and how he went against those codes and conventions of the society. The town do all judge each other as well, obviously. We do have this blame game, particularly towards the end of the text. And even Elizabeth Proctor, who's meant to be this really virtuous woman, she even judges other people. She judges Sarah Good and Bridget Bishop as well, which is, I think, a really pertinent point, because it suggests that everyone judges other people, that no one is beyond that. In the Dressmaker, we do obviously have Sergeant Farrett, who is the law, so we have that nice link with Judge Danforth. He is quite lax in the way that he, I guess, upholds the law, especially in the sleepy town of Dungatar. We have these self-appointed judges like Almanac and Beulah, and I guess once again that idea that all the town judges each other through, again, the secrets they hold or withhold, the fashion, their appearance, and so forth. So there are some nice connections there between who is judged and who judges others, and I think when we get to the next question, it is at the crux of particularly the Crucible. So the idea of who is not judged, I think, is really prominent within the Crucible. The fact that the court in Salem is above reproach. This is all part of Miller's authorial intent. He wants to point out the hypocrisy that is rife within 1950s America. And there's a lot you can do with this, but I think the main thing to point out is that this is an allegorical play, that Miller is pointing out that what is happening in 1950s America, this ruminating suspicion, this fear of communism that has pervaded society, has done previously as well in 1690s Salem. And in fact, Miller's commentary, particularly in those first 4 or 5 pages, really paints this picture that this is a historical issue. And he paints this cautionary tale that this is what happens when you have absolute power. I've got some quotes here that I think are really useful. The first one from Judge Danforth, when he says a person is either with this court or must be counted against it. There be no road in between. That real black and white thinking, and almost, again, the hypocritical nature of the court. The fact that so many individuals were forced to confess to witchcraft or be hanged is a really good thing to analyse, particularly because it's quite relevant to the McCarthyism and to HUAC, which of course Arthur Miller was summoned to about 3 years after he wrote the play. The other quotation I really like about Judgment is from Rebecca Nurse, when she says, "Another judgment awaits us all," at the end of the text. She of course sacrifices her life for her moral integrity, and this idea of what judgment is, and a fear of judgment as well. She holds this, and it's prevalent within Christianity, this idea that you are judged at the end of your life, and this is what provides her with hope. So thinking about a character focus on Judgment, I think John Proctor and Tilly Dunnage are the easy ones, or the obvious ones to focus on. They are of course both protagonists in the text. They are both nonconformists to an extent. I think Tilly tries to, through her fashion, but they are both nonconformists. Think about where they live even. John Proctor obviously lives away from the town. Tilly Dunnage lives on the hill. They receive social judgment from the town. John Proctor, because, as I've said previously, the fact that he could not recite his commandments, that's counted against him. The fact that he worked on the Sabbath and didn't attend church, counted against him. For Tilly, of course, it is because she allegedly murdered Stuart Pettyman, and because, of course, she is a bastard child. She was not brought up in the world within a marriage. And then we have that self-judgment. So John Proctor judges himself for his indiscretion with Abigail, he's also judged within his relationship for that. And it's all this. The whole play is all about him trying to redeem himself and atoning for his sins, and he does that at the end with an honourable and noble death. Tilly's self-judgment is all about Stuart Pettyman's death and the guilt she feels for that, and she defines it as a black thing on page 184. That's a great quotation when it comes to things like blame, guilt and judgment. Teddy tries to reassure her, just as Elizabeth tries to reassure John at the end of the text. And sadly, we have 2 deaths that follow soon after this. So while John's is honourable, Teddy's death is quite sad, because finally Tilly was able to trust someone. She was able to find acceptance, and then that was taken away from her quite cruelly. So following this, her ending is slightly different. It's vengeful, it's destructive. I've gone through this a number of times, but how you want to analyse her actions at the end of the text is up to you, whether you want to say they were justified or not, in terms of the way she punishes the town for their actions towards her, and of course her mother as well. So there's nice similarities between our 2 protagonists when it comes to the theme of judgment. When looking at differences, I think Judge Danforth and Beulah are good to look at. Firstly, because of their position within the communities. Danforth is the legal religious judge. He is appointed by the courts, whereas Beulah is sort of more self-appointed to judge others in the town. Danforth is quite stubborn, he's hypocritical, he uses flawed judgment. We know in the stage directions that introduce him that he has an exact loyalty to his cause and to the position, and that remains throughout the text. He is not swayed at all. We should note as well that Reverend Hale, unlike Danforth, Reverend Hale does actually change. So that's worth noting as well, and he's a really interesting one to look at as well, because he judges himself as well, and he feels quite guilty for what has happened. With Beulah, she's much more invasive. We see her continuously, time and time again, invading other people's spaces and looking in. We know that she knows a lot about Sergeant Farrett, for example, and she reveals that. Her name is good to look at here as well. Obviously, Harridan being like a bossy, belligerent woman, and that's something, of course, you can analyse. And what Ham does, it's very Dickensian, as Miss Chesterfield said the other day. She reverts to lying to maintain her power. We know that it's the secret she holds that provides her with the power. We know that she lies. She tells people that Trudy was 8 months, well, she gave birth 8 months after her marriage, which suggests that she had sex before marriage. We know that's not the case. She's, of course, injured ironically. The record player that goes flying out the window blinds her, and she's sent to a mental asylum. So, again, differing characters here that you can look at, and while we don't want you in your essays to compare characters, they're more so what you use to compare your ideas and the messages that are within both the texts. So with ideas, these are just 6 sentences or statements that link to judgment that you might want to look at in a bit more detail in order to gain a really wide-reaching perspective on this theme. So the idea that both texts explore judgment within insular societies. I've said before many times that insular societies in the setting is a really, really good way into any theme. The fact that both texts examine the relationship between institutional judgment and punishment, which we sort of looked at previously. We also looked at the idea that both protagonists judge themselves harshly, based on their past too, I should say. The fact that both towns exhibit judgment as a pervasive and destructive force. The idea that both texts examine the role of blame and judgment. You could even go as far as saying guilt and judgment as well. And this last idea that both the play and the novel explore the importance of forgiveness following judgment. And perhaps you can look at the idea of atonement as well, how one atones for themselves. So with all these ideas, definitely look at characters, but also think about the way the authors can convey these ideas about judgment? Is it through their authorial intent, what messages they're trying to get or pass on to the audience? Is it through any language they're using? We know Ham particularly likes to use animal imagery. We know Arthur Miller uses stage directions and is far more explicit in how he provides information to the audience. I'll refer you back to our previous video about style, structure and language, which gave you a brief little snapshot of what you can look at when it comes to analysing these things. So let's have a look at an essay topic. This is an essay topic which has 2 quotations, so you might get one of these. More often than not in the exam, one has quotations, one won't. This one has, "The magistrate sits in your heart that judges you, from the Crucible and from the Dressmaker. It is a black thing, oh wait, it makes itself invisible, then creeps back when I feel safest. Compare how the Crucible and the Dressmaker examine the role of judgment." With this, think about the quotations. You should hopefully know where they come from. The first one is of course from Elizabeth when talking to John Proctor about what he should do. The second one, of course, is from Tilly when she is speaking with Teddy after being locked out of the ball, and she opens up to him about how she feels about the death of Stuart Pettyman. So what ideas can you draw from this? And again, for topic sentences, I like to begin with anyway to use this really broad statement that both texts explore or both texts examine. And the first thing you could look at is how both texts explore or examine the idea of judgment within insular and conservative communities. It could be that you explore the relationship between judgment and punishment, and perhaps you might also explore personal judgment or self-judgment and the path to atonement. Again, with your comparative essays, there are so many ways you can go about it. In English, there's not one answer, there is a million answers. So you might have other ideas. That's completely okay. Go with your strengths and go with ideas where you have the evidence to support